correspond with the assignment that everyone has been working on. And the first thing we're going to do is to check out the first 9 true statements about 1942 1943. That goes right along with part 1 of your assignment. Remember, you were to decide whether or not you thought those statements were true or false, and then go through the text, which we embedded right inside of the assignment, to make all of those statements true. So at the end of that process, you should have the 9 true statements. These are 9 very important things to know about World War II during 1942 and 1943. So let's get started. Let's go over that a little bit. One of the things that you'll see in 1942 is that the Japanese are on a rampage. They are on a rampage across the Pacific, conquering all sorts of territories held by the European powers, held by the Americans. Japan is lashing out to try to gobble up as many natural resources as possible. They are also, of course, trying to create sort of a defensive perimeter, almost a geographical ring around their home islands in Japan. And so after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese launch another series of attacks on American bases. And we're going to see that here in the next video. All across the Pacific, places like Guam, Wake Island, which they called the Alamo of the Pacific War, and even the Philippines, which was once an American possession. You'll see that not only do the Japanese attack American possessions around the Pacific, but also other European nations as well, like Britain and France. And so one of the other things that you were to discover is that in 1942, the Japanese conquered the Philippines, Hong Kong, Burma, the East Indies, and Singapore. All that was right there inside of the file and the reading. And then, of course, one of the things to know as well about the Japanese is that they were incredibly cruel to any of the people that they conquered. We already had mentioned that a little bit when we talked about the Japanese invasion of China and what they had done to the people of Nanking and other places across mainland China. Well, the Japanese were especially brutal to prisoners of war. The Japanese felt like it was a sign of cowardice to surrender, and the Japanese soldiers had no respect for Americans and British soldiers surrendering, and so they committed horrible atrocities, torture, starvation, lots of disease ran through prisoner of war camps, even executions sometimes. And one of the most famous examples of this is in the Philippines with the Bataan Death March. And so you see in that third statement there about how the Japanese were especially cruel to American troops in the Bataan Peninsula and sent them on the Death March, where thousands of American soldiers died in the Philippines after the Japanese conquered it. Also then, after the attack on Pearl Harbor and into 1942, we see, though, that eventually that rampage that the Japanese are on is going to be stopped. You see, and you might remember this from your U.S. class, the Doolittle Raid in 1942 was the first American attack on the Japanese homeland. General Doolittle actually had B-24s, these large bomber airplanes. He retrofitted to fly off of a carrier, and he and his men were able to fly from an aircraft carrier all the way to the Japanese home islands, bomb Tokyo. Most of them crashed in China and had to bail out over China, and some of them were captured and killed, of course. But it showed the Japanese that the United States was capable, of course, of striking back. Then we're going to be talking about 2 other very important battles in the Pacific that stopped that Japanese aggression, and those would be the battles of Coral Sea and the Battle of Midway. The Battle of Coral Sea stops the Japanese from moving south to places like Australia and New Zealand. As the Japanese spread further and further south through Southeast Asia, through the Dusty Jindies, they were threatening to attack Australia and New Zealand, other places in that region of the world as well. And so the Battle of Coral Sea sort of stops that. And then the turning point in the Battle of the Pacific against the Japanese is at a place called Midway, where the Japanese attack is stopped, and we'll get into that a little bit more in the next video. But basically, after that point, the Japanese are sort of on the retreat as we start to island hop and push them back towards the home islands. So those are three more. And then the last three true and false statements that you should know deal with some of the other fighting outside of the Pacific. In 1942-1943, not only do you have all those things going on in the Pacific, but you also have North Africa. And we already started to talk a little bit about how the Italians had begun that North African campaign from Libya, trying to conquer Egypt and the Suez Canal, which was controlled by Britain, and how they were stopped. And then later on, the Germans had sent in their Africa Corps, led by Rommel. And of course, Rommel, we talked a little bit about in class. You're going to see that the Desert Fox actually is finally stopped at a place called El Alamein in 1942 by British Field Marshal Montgomery. And you'll see in North Africa that fighting going back and forth until eventually the Germans are pushed out of Tunisia. Then, of course, in 1942, you have the Battle of Stalingrad. Stalingrad is probably maybe the cruelest battle in all of world history. The Germans and the Soviets fighting it out literally house by house, room by room. Incredible fierce fighting and cruelty to one another. And the Battle of Stalingrad turns out to be the turning point in the European conflict, whereas now the Germans are going to be pushed out of the Soviet Union and on back into Germany along the Eastern Front. And you'll spend some time looking at Stalingrad, and we'll talk about it in one of our videos. And then last but not least, at the end of 1943, you see the Allies looking for a place to invade. Even though Stalin is hoping they invade France, they actually end up invading Italy. And they start off in the island of Sicily and then eventually onto the boot of Italy as 1943 comes to an end. So, that being said, those are the 9 things you should know about 1942 and 1943 for part 1 of the assignment. And in the videos to follow, we'll be talking a little bit about all of the important information that is in the assignment as well. So hopefully that helps you get started with this. Please make sure that you have all 9 of those statements written in a true format so that when you paste them into the Google Doc, you can get full credit. All right, very good. We'll see you on the next one.